A very good afternoon to all my dear students. Today it is your first class of English, and as we have already discussed in your last class, that we will start with the poem Upon Westminister Bridge by none other than one of the premier members of the romantic group of poets, William Wordsworth. Now, if you look at the first day of our class, where I talk about some ideas about romanticism, I mentioned about the French Revolution and how French Revolution actually paved the way for the romantic movement to be started. And as I already mentioned in your last class, the year 1798, in which year the lyrical ballads was published jointly by Wordsworth and his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge. That year is regarded as the beginning of the Romantic Age in English literature. And as you already know, as I mentioned, that this era emphasized on imagination, emotions, feelings, and ideas. So it's not about the dry prose writing. Here, the poets tried to address the emotions, the intellect, the feelings of the people. Because literature, what we always call it, is an expression of emotion. And the romantic poetry is a perfect example of that emotions coming out through their writings. And as I mentioned, the main features of romantic poetry, I have already discussed in the class, but I'm just going by points. Number one is called return to nature. That means it's a glorification of nature. That what William Wordsworth was perfectly termed as the worshipper of nature. Point number two is here the interest or the emphasis goes to the common man. Because literature is for all. It's not only for the educated and elite class people. That's why they use the real life language and they term them as the real language of men. They put emphasis on individualism. That is, it's an expression of individual thoughts and feelings. Imagination is a very important tool to express their feelings and emotions. And they have a strong sense of emotions and feelings. These are mostly the important features of romantic poetry, which you have already seen in my presentation. Now coming to that, who are the romantic poets? Group of poets, predominantly 5 poets can be named: William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Lord Byron, and P.B. Shelley. And the most important thing is that all the romantic poets, they celebrated the rustic life or the village life, which was to them was the original life, where you will get the actual life and the life full of vitality. City life was to them was a life of suffering. It's a claustrophobic, polluted atmosphere. That's why they always love to go back to the country, go back to the villages, to get the original meaning of life. Now coming to the poem was composed in 1802, and the poem, while the poet was crossing the famous Westminister Bridge in London, the poet was viewing the city of London in the early daylight, when it was dawn, when the city is in complete sleep. And if you look at the theme, as I mentioned about what Wordsworth describes as his definition of poetry, which I will definitely give it to you, that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. It's very important. You need to have a peace of mind. You need to enjoy the moment in the peaceful, tranquil, and serene atmosphere. At that point of time only you can feel the beauty of that nature. And the early morning, he mentioned about the early morning when the world was completely in a sleeping mood and the poet was crossing the Westminister Bridge. And if you look at the poem, the first line is very important. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by. You know, if you remember Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, Frost once said that I don't know who is the owner of the woods. That means that owner of the woods lacks the feelings, lacks the emotion to feel the beauty of nature. Although both are completely different types of poetry, but still, when we talk about the nature, because when we often say this, that beauty lies in the eye of the beholder. The scene, what is beautiful in your eyes, may be a very dry and simple thing to another one. A sight so touching in its majesty. It's the sight we are talking about is the early morning when the city was in complete sleep, and it's the only time when you will have the smokeless air. That means pollution free air. It is the tranquility in the morning before the industrialization continues. And if you analyze the poem in details, you can understand the poet's main focus was the beauty of the early morning. So you can understand the busyness or the claustrophobic atmosphere of the London city is being contrasted to the beauty of the early morning. If you look at that line, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air, and this line, this beautiful expression of, as I mentioned, that romantic poetry is an expression of feelings, expression of thoughts. That is, never saw I, never felt a calm so deep. That calmness, that serenity of mind, that peace of mind can be only felt if you have the power to feel the beauty of nature. You know, I often say a word that nature is not mute. It is human who is deaf, because we don't have the power to feel the serenity, feel the beauty of nature. The river, which is being referred here, as you all know, the river Thames is being referred to here. The river is flowing in its own sweet will, as if the natural elements or the natural objects are doing its job, because it's only possible because the city is in deep sleep right now. And so the poet was deeply impressed by the silence of the city. You know, silence also has a sound. We need to have the power, we need to have the feeling to feel the silence of nature. And you can understand the London city is being presented here not a wonder of civilization, but a lovely face of nature, as if the early morning of the morning mist that covered up the city, and the city was free from pollution, free from any kind of a cluster. So in this poem, if you, as I already detailedly analyze the poem, you can see that the poet, as if the poet has a personal relationship with nature, and he glorifies the majestic city of London in the glittering rays of the rising sun. So, as we discussed in details the poem, you can easily understand. Here the poet talked about his inner emotions, the emotions which are coming or which is getting an expression through that poetry. And the poet finds an unparalleled beauty. It's unparalleled. Nothing can be compared to the beauty of the early morning, which spread over the valleys, rocks, hills, domes, ships, and everywhere. So it is a serene scene. It is a scene full of serenity, full of beauty, full of wonder. And the poet here completely agrees to the fact that nature is beautiful. Truly, nature has no comparison to anything. Okay, so I think we have discussed the poem in details. You just go through the poem along with the presentation, and I'm going to give you some analysis which will help you to understand the poem in a better manner. And then if you have any questions, We can have the discussions later on, but read the poem. It's a must to go through the poem in details, in line by line, in words by words. Okay, so thank you everyone. Follow the presentation along with the discussion. We'll meet again in the next class. Thank you. Good afternoon, all of you. Today we are here with the second audio analysis class of the poem Upon Westminister Bridge by William Wordsworth. Now, as we have discussed in the last class, and I think all of you have gone through the presentation and the audio analysis, I talk about romantic poetry, features of romantic poetry. I tried to look at different angles of the poem to put forward the point that it is an remarkable poem of romantic literature. Now today I just want to take you through some different areas. When we talk about poetry, it's very important we talk about the poetic devices. It's very important we will talk about the style of writing. It's very important we will talk about the use of rhetorics, because all these make the writing or the poetry more beautiful. So today what I thought of, I will start with the poetic devices in the poem and with the rhetoric. What is rhetoric? It is a kind of a device which makes the writing beautiful. And if you look at rhetoric, there are several rhetorics like simile, metaphor, personification, epigram, alliteration, pun, imagery. Many things are there. Now we will discuss 2-3 things about this in this class. As you all know that while you are writing your question answers, these are the very important informations which you can put, and these will make your writing different. Now if you look at the text, those who are aware of the classes, they already know about the fact that in our last class we have discussed a little bit about simile and metaphor. Simile, we refer to simile as an explicit comparison and metaphor as an implicit comparison. That means if I give you an example, the camel is the ship of desert. If I say this line, so it's an example of which, because the role of the ship in a sea is similar to the role of the camel in a desert. That means we are referring to the mode of transport. That's why it is an example of metaphor. But simile is the explicit comparison where everything is clear. If you look at this text, if I read the line that the city now doth like a garment wear, that means city wears the beauty of the early morning, beauty of the early morning when the sun is about to come. So beautiful use of the expression, beautiful use of the rhetoric simile. Next I'm coming to it, it's what we call personification. It's a very, very powerful rhetoric which you see in writings. When we put qualities of animate qualities on inanimate objects. Now if you look at that text, there is a line that the river, about the river, it says about the river, and it's about the houses. The very houses seem asleep. See, how can the houses seem asleep? The inhabitants of the house can seem asleep. So that means this quality is being attributed to the inanimate objects. That's why it's an example of personification. So these are some of the writings, some of the rhetorics which make the poetry much more beautiful. Now, if I look at the another side of it, Wordsworth's, as I already told you in the last class, that the romantics always wanted the village life or the country life. And if you look at the text, Wordsworth puts forward a negative impact of industrialization on the city of London. When he described the city of London, it was the time when everything is in deep sleep. That means it's a smokeless air, as I mentioned, pollution free air. So beauty can be enjoyed only for that point of time. For other time, it's the hustle and bury, it's that claustrophobic, polluted atmosphere we are referring to here. And city life has been described by the romantics as the city pained. That means it's a painful life. It's as if the life of a prison house. So it's very important to analyze this poem from these different angles. Also, what you will do, whatever question answers I have given, see, these are the central questions which will help you to answer many questions that will come from the text. So read the text well, try to understand the different areas, and then read out the question, because you can understand by this time onwards you should be ready for analytical questions, because questions will come from your understanding of the text, and that is very, very important. And if I have to sum it up, if you look at the last two lines of the poem, dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all the mighty heart is lying still. So that means the poet makes an impassioned address to God. It's an address to God, who is the creator of all beauty upon the earth, to express his sincere gratitude. It's a sense of gratitude from the part of the poets to the great God, the creator of that universe. That means, because if you term him as nature, that's why romantic poetry, it's a celebration, it's a glorification of nature. So that's why in that respect, this is a very, very important sonnet, or it's a very, very important poem which talked about different aspects of our life. So I think it's clear. Still, if you have any doubts, you can ask me in the interactive classes. We'll discuss it later on. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.